Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. I'm going to take you through the conclusion of the second FIDE Grand Prix tournament in Belgrade. So in the final we have Richard Rapport against Dmitry Andreikin. Now let me just give you a quick recap of how the players got there. Rapport defeated Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Andreikin, rather surprisingly, defeated Anish Giri, but Andreikin is a very, very solid player, and very sensible, and he held his nerve really well against Giri and through to the final. Now Rapport and Andreikin drew their first game. Once again, Andreikin super solid with the white pieces. So in this second classical game, Rapport with white, and if this is also drawn, then they would go into a tie-break. But let's see what happened. So far, could be, well, this could go into any kinds of openings. Queen's Gambit declined, Tarrasch, Ragozin. But Andreikin played a6, and this is quite a trendy line at the moment. And, well, that certainly could lead to a more interesting position than some other openings. So the idea is to take and then potentially to support that pawn here, or if that pawn is recaptured, then to push and threaten something on c4. So normally that induces this exchange on d5, and that's exactly what Rapport did. So now a3. Now that is an unusual move in this position. We've seen knight f3, we've seen bishop f4, but a3 is pretty strange, it has to be said. And I mean, some of you might have seen my tweet that I said normally I tell my students never to play like this, with these little ears at the side of the board. I mean, a3, it's kind of a waiting move actually. Perhaps then after knight f6 you're going to pin with the bishop on g5. But yeah, it's just waiting to see how black commits actually, and it could be useful later on, perhaps to push with b4. But it is a pretty strange move, and frankly, do not try this at home. And then, yes, having tweeted, I said, ooh, don't like these little ears. Then Andreikin played h6. We got another little ear at the side of the board. Incredible. So he wants to play knight f6 and doesn't want to allow the move bishop g5. Amazing stuff. Bishop f4. So now, well, sensible development. Knight f6 and e3. And because Rapport has played a3, then Andreikin obviously considered that he could strike out in the middle with bishop c5 rather. And of course it's a very sensible move. You could also just play bishop d6 here, challenging the bishop on f4. Also sensible. But c5, why not? And here, instead of knight f3, which looks pretty normal, Rapport played bishop e5. He's playing these moves, well, there was some thought going into them. He wasn't playing that quickly, but bishop e5, moving the bishop for a second time, certainly looks a little bit strange. Again, one of those things, don't move the same piece twice in the opening. So both sides breaking all the rules. But clearly there's a bit of pressure here, and that means there's pressure here. So bishop e6 guards the d-pawn, so bishop takes f6 isn't a threat. Knight e2, so again, slightly unorthodox, but instead of playing to f3, Rapport wants to play to f4 to have the bishop in the knight's sights. Knight c6, sensible development, looking at the bishop and pressurizing d4. Knight f4, looking at the bishop. So, I mean, obviously, if this is taken, then white can take here and potentially take on e6. Well, that looks pretty nice for white. So Andreikin took on d4. And bishop takes. Knight takes. I mean, this looks pretty pleasant for black. Once this dark squared bishop goes, then I would have thought that white is black is absolutely fine here. I think black is equalised already. You could just go rook c8 here and bishop c5 to expel the queen. That's reasonable, and maybe even go for a quick d4. But bishop d6, of course, is really sensible, just keeping an eye on the knight. Now g3. So maybe bishop g2, or maybe this can be taken and then bishop h3, that's an option. Rook c8. And here it is possible to take here actually and play bishop h3. But rook d1 instead, bit of pressure there, but queen a5. So that's a bit annoying because now bishop takes and the knight would be undermined. I mean, black could play bishop takes. I mean, I think that's really what Rapport was hoping for, because the exchange of bishop for knight does leave white with quite nice control over d4, for example. But queen a5 is a much more interesting move. So there's a threat to take here and then take here. So the rook came back to guard c3. I mean, it certainly doesn't look like white has anything really at all in this position. Knight takes bishop, pawn takes, and bishop h3. So there's a little bit of pressure here. But now that the pawns are joined up, it doesn't seem like a big deal for black at all. And now rook c4 drives the queen back. And bishop e5 is a fantastic square for this bishop. Just looking at c3, but also looking through the knight at the pawn on b2. So knight e2 just takes the pressure off. Now if that's taken, then the rook could switch here. And because the king is on f7, then when white takes there, that's actually pretty annoying. And this knight would like to swing in here as well to attack e6. So I think quite understandably after knight e2, Andreikin just plays very solidly and plays rook c8. And some exchanges and things look pretty quiet. If pawn takes, then maybe white could have a bit of fun there, because this pawn is a little isolated, the king is a little exposed. Maybe this knight would come out here at some point. Okay, that looks as though it would give white a reason to play on, let's put it like that. So rook takes looks sensible, active rook. And here is where Rapport decides to try and shake things up. Now of course, he can play solidly here, but he starts to risk things a little bit. b4. So, well, I guess bishop takes pawn isn't going to happen, but still, the a3 pawn looks a little bit weak. Queen a4 looks like a nice move. The queen perhaps could come in here if black manages to exchange queens. I think Andreikin would be very happy there. I mean, black's pieces certainly look better than white's. But no backing down from Rapport. Knight f4. Attacking that pawn there with knight and bishop. So that has to be taken. But this exchange somehow feels okay for black, because you'll notice this diagonal has now opened up. That's now a passed pawn. Once again, if queens are exchanged, I think black would be very happy. That pawn is vulnerable. So queen c6 looks like a sensible move. Just bringing the queen back to guard this pawn. Keeps nice control over the c-file. The rook might come here. Might come to c2. Queen e3. So a little bit of pressure there. But that could be neutralized. Maybe the rook. But Andreikin goes for knight e4, which looks very sensible. Throwing the knight in. And if white wants to disturb that knight, then you've got to play f3. And that's exactly what Rapport does. But this is risky, because this diagonal opens. Yes, the queen is blocking on e3, but even so, it also exposes the second rank. So Rapport is really taking risks to try to stir things up in this position. He was also a bit short of time. Rook c3 attacks the queen. The queen comes to d4, maintains this active position, and also still covers that diagonal. Rook c4. The queen goes back to e3. So in effect, Andreikin is proposing a draw in this position, and the position repeated again. So if Rapport wants a draw, he could just bring the queen back to e3. Threefold repetition of the position. But remarkably, Rapport invested more time here. His clock was right down to a couple of minutes. Still had to get to move 40. Still 10 moves to move 40. He played on. Queen e5. This is an incredible risk. You're low on time. Your opponent has active pieces. Your king is a little bit exposed. But what Rapport was gambling on was perhaps that the knight would drop back, and then white could perhaps be optimistic with pressure here. But Andreikin, after a little reflection, threw the knight into d2. Excellent move. Attacks the rook, looks at this pawn here. So you don't want to play rook there, allowing a huge family fork. So this is problematic for white. But this is what Rapport had been calculating. And he played pawn to f5. He's managed to actually break open black's king, but at a cost. He gives up that rook on f1. F takes e6 check. And here is the crunch moment in the game. Where should that king go? Andreikin had more time than Rapport. He had time to calculate this through. He played his king back to e8, and that avoids a check here. In fact, the counterintuitive move, king e7, is the best move. And then after this, well, this should be a draw. Let me show you how. I mean, this looks pretty scary with this pawn potentially queening. But here, well, let's just see. How can black draw like this? I mean, white has to be a little bit careful, actually. But in this position, you give up the rook. And then, well, the king basically has no escape. No escape from the perpetual, that is. This is just going to end in a draw. Like this. I mean, if the king comes up the board, there's even a risk it could be checkmated. But this is just a draw, basically. And the queen and the bishop simply cannot help with the defense. It's a draw by perpetual check. Let's go back. So, remarkably, king e7, allowing white to take a pawn with check, that should draw. Instead, Andreikin played king e8, which looks like a better move. But after this, there are problems. So Andreikin played queen b6. If queen c7, basically white's threat is to check, of course. Okay, let me make a random move. Let's suppose the knight comes out. This is the threat. Here, and pawn goes through with check. And of course, white is just winning that position with an extra queen. Andreikin played queen b6. Queen c7 is a better defense, but ultimately should lose. King takes. And incredibly, I mean, at first glance, it looks like actually black should be winning this, because the queen and the rook somehow seem to have a very strong attack against the king. But after, for example, a check like this, well, no more sensible checks. Or rook c2, king d3. Again, no more sensible checks. And the difference in this variation is that the queen is able to defend here. So Andreikin actually gave up the rook, hoping for a perpetual check. But this is the difference. Instead of having the queen on f8, the queen is on this diagonal. So it can come back to enable the king to avoid a perpetual check. There was a little bit of repetition, but finally the king got here. And you can see that if check, then the queen is ready to interpose, and that is going to be winning for white. The game ended like this. Here, if queen d1, king steps up again, and you'll notice the checks are running out. That's going to be the end of that. If queen c2, then you can play queen here and no more sensible checks, and then it'll be white's turn at the other end of the board. So in fact, in this position, Andreikin thought for some time. They both reached the time control, and Andreikin played queen f1 check, a little joke at the end of the game. And bishop takes queen. He resigned the game. I mean, this was an incredibly brave decision. If I come back to this moment, really brave from Rapport. Instead of moving back with queen e3, that would have meant a draw, and they go into a rapid play tiebreak, which I would say Rapport would be the favourite, but still, you know, the match continues. Instead, Rapport risked an enormous amount with queen e5. He could easily lose this position, particularly when you're short of time. But his optimism paid off, and he won the game. So Richard Rapport wins the second FIDE Grand Prix in Belgrade, and he puts himself in a fantastic position. There is one Grand Prix tournament to go, but Rapport now has 20 points. And remember, there are 2 slots available for players to go through to the candidates, and just 1 tournament left. So, I mean, obviously, Aronian and Nakamura did very well in the first tournament, so they have a chance. But they're playing in the same group in Berlin. I should say the next and the third and final FIDE Grand Prix tournament is going to be held in Berlin from 21st of March to the 4th of April, so in a week's time. It's going to be really interesting, but Rapport looks like he has a great chance to secure one of those spots for the candidates tournament. And with that, he moves up on the live rating list. He's number 7 in the world, playing really well at the moment. And, well, I'm a huge fan of Richard Rapport, such an enterprising player. And, well, we saw that in the opening with this move a3. He's just different. He's kind of on a different beat to other players. But it paid off here. Thanks for watching.